Joseph Chuman. Dr. Chuman has been the leader of the Ethical Culture Society of Bergen County, New Jersey since 1974. He joined our fraternity of leaders here in 2008. Throughout his career, Joe has been deeply involved with all the critical issues that affect ethical culture that ethical culture tries to impact, including human rights, civil liberties, and opposition to the death penalty. He founded the New Jersey group of Amnesty International, is now president of the Bergen County Sanctuary for Asylum Seekers. That's founded by the Bergen Society. This organization provides support services for asylum seekers who have been released from federal detention, and maybe Joe can tell us how DACA affects that issue. Dr. Chuman teaches graduate courses in human rights at Columbia University and is taught at the United Nations University for Peace in Costa Rica. His byline has appeared on numerous articles in local and national publications, including some on our table back there. The title of his talk this morning is something a little long for our banners outside, but Ethical Culture Beyond Belief and Humanism's Farther Reaches. Dr. Joe Chuman.
I devote my initial address in September to interpretations of ethical culture and to our underlying philosophy of humanism, which I plan to do this morning. What I also want to do is talk about ways in which, after many years, my own thinking about humanism, my own understanding about it has evolved, and where I have basically landed, at least for the time being. I held my first class, human rights class, which is what I teach. My first class in human rights in the new semester at Hunter College. I teach not only at Columbia, but I work with undergraduates at Hunter, and I'm fortunate that I can consolidate all my teaching into one day. Thursday is my teaching day. I start out at Hunter and then I teach an evening class at Columbia. But I first held my class at Columbia at Hunter 2 weeks ago on Thursday. It's an advanced human rights class comprised mostly of juniors and seniors. The class is more than 3 hours long, and during the second class a week ago, during the break in the middle, I was approached by one of the students who had a request. In totally unaccented English, she asked me if she could leave the class a bit early in order to attend a meeting of DACA students, of which she is one. I asked her about a situation, and she explained that she was brought to the United States by her parents from a Latin American country, which I will not name, when she was 8 years old. She is an altogether pleasant young woman who, despite her circumstances, seemed upbeat and hopeful, but I could not resist the thought that her disposition masked what must have been an underlying fear and sense of dread and uncertainty. Things may not turn out well for her. At the end of the day, she could very well be seized, put on a plane, and sent to her country she barely knows better than I do. Her hopes and dreams for the future and her investment in college totally upended and destroyed. I must admit that I see teaching both at Hunter and Columbia and being able to educate my students as a privilege and a sacred trust. I also confess that I personally feel protective of my students, recognizing that they could readily be my own children, or more realistically in recent decades, my grandchildren. My immediate unspoken feeling was one of compassion for this delightful young woman, coupled with a desire to want to help her. But that emotion was immediately followed by a sense of helplessness, recognizing that in the foreseeable future there is nothing I can do, no intervention I can undertake that would rescue her from what might be a very sorrowful outcome. It was a brief human encounter that brought with it for me a strong emotional resonance. Well, I begin with this simple anecdote as being emblematic of what I understand humanism to be in the wider sense, in its wider embrace. My encounter with this winsome young woman was a brief one, but for me it was a humanistic moment. Hopefully what I am trying to convey will become clear as my presentation unfolds, but first some context. As we all know, we are living at a very coarse moment in American history. It's an unsettling moment and a dangerous moment. In less than a year, it feels as if we have been ripped from our moorings. Those values and assumptions that we have taken for granted as fixed and have endowed us with a sense of security suddenly have been upended, and we are left insecure and perhaps bewildered and frightened, as well as outraged and angry. It feels as if we have gone down the rabbit hole and have suddenly been transported into an Alice in Wonderland universe where the fixed points that define our reality have been kicked away or stood on their head. The chronic promotion of lies as if they were truths, the heralding of, quote, alternative facts and behaving as if evidence, even if it stares you in the face, makes no difference. All this is the most radical assault imaginable on the maintenance of a coherent society as well as on individual sanity. It feels like madness. Without a shared commitment to truthfulness, there can be no trust among people, and the human bond, which is essential for our survival, unravels and eventually dissolves. But we don't have to go that far. We don't have to go that far to be profoundly concerned. We have taken for granted our democracy. Latin American nations in the recent past and African nations still may have their coups, their autocrats, their tyrants, and shaky and corrupt governments which come and go like the wind, but not America. We are the exception, we tell ourselves, but today we are forced to think that maybe our self-assurance has been misplaced, and we are compelled to worry, really worry, if and how American democracy and its freedoms will endure. The decades since the Second World War have left many of us feeling that we were moving in a slow but inexorable march towards progress, as more and more classes of people who were traditionally excluded from the circle of equality have become more recognized and included within that widening circle. African Americans, women, gays, people from foreign lands bringing their new cultures, the disabled. Progress may have been halting and accompanied by struggle, but we were making progress nevertheless towards a more pluralistic, more inclusive, and more tolerant society. With the emergence of Donald Trump, we are witnessing a resurgence, a legitimation, and mainstreaming of hatred, which we assumed was confined to the extreme margins of society and the possession of a few cranks and crackpots. America has always possessed strong currents of racism and jingoism, to be sure, but now nationalism and naked racism issue from the most powerful office in the land. Now the word Nazi in America has become normalized. Now it is as if the lid has been taken off of civilization and civility, and a raw, primitive, bestial underside of humanity's darkest propensities and impulses have been unleashed. Suddenly our current condition seems insecure and our future uncertain. It is nothing less than very disturbing and raises the question which we have never before been forced to ask, namely, with an unhinged autocrat and demagogue as our president, are our democratic institutions stable and strong enough to withstand and outlast this foul wind which pollutes and poisons American society? Well, the greatest sign of hope, I think, is that the menace that confronts us has inspired resistance at all levels and throughout multiple precincts of American society. Resistance is the answer. We need to join with others to resist, organize, speak out, defy, and frustrate evil at every turn, and assert pressure at every point in the service of preserving our cherished freedom and our democracy, reason and civility, mutual respect, inclusion, and decency. Which brings me to ethical culture. I truly believe that ethical culture and the humanism that undergirds it embodies the values that stand in direct opposition to the evils that confront us. In embryo, we are the answer to forces that threaten American society. Ethical culture answers tyranny with freedom, autocracy with democracy. Where we see bigotry and hatred, ethical culture stands for respect and reverence for the other. Where Trumpism promotes white nationalism, ethical culture stands for social pluralism and the beauty of the human mosaic. Where Trump thrives on scapegoating, ethical culture promotes compassion and human solidarity. Where reactionary politics fosters a society of economic disparity and privilege, ethical culture holds out an egalitarian vision and a commitment to equality. Where Trump embellishes lies and forsakes the truth on which all society is noted as ultimately based for the sake of power, ethical culture exalts the search for truth. Where Trump panders to anti-intellectualism and mocks the reality of facts while disparaging evidence, reason, and science, ethical culture upholds these commitments as essential for social survival and commensurate with what is good and civilizing and ennobling in the human experience. Ethical culture has never been a quietist organization. We are activists, and we are called to put our values into action. However tired we may be, these times they demand that we recommit ourselves to the struggle. It is a precept of ethical culture that the future is an open future, and we human beings have some power and some ability, we don't know how much, to mold our own future in concert with our aspirations, our ideals, and the values that we hold. But in these times, which call us to engage the political struggle, I think we need to be able to do two things simultaneously. We need to engage the struggle, I believe, with a sense of militancy, but while we do so, we need to make sure that we hold on to our own values and do not begin to look like the evils we are fighting. We need to hold fast to our humanistic values, both for our own sake as individual women and men, and as a foil to the negative and destructive political and social environment that we confront. If what ethical culture stands for and what it does is an answer to the destructive forces which have come so quickly to dominate our political lives, then this address early in the new season provides a good opportunity to probe the question of what more precisely are the values that ethical culture and its underlying philosophy of humanism put forward. This is the mainstay of what I want to share with you now. Next year will mark my 50th year of affiliation with ethical culture and my 49th in a professional capacity. Friends, it's beginning to feel like a career. Right? Wait until next year to applaud. It'll be half a century. Actually, I joined this society, the New York Society, when I was 20 years old in 1968. So it'll be 50 years. And then the next year I became a leader in training here. So in my almost half century, I have never, however, felt for a moment or lost the belief, doubted for a moment or lost a belief in the importance of what our movement represents, and perhaps now more so than ever. But I must admit that my understanding of humanism has evolved, and this address is a sharing of that evolution and an attempt to explain where I've currently arrived. It is one of the wonderful things about ethical culture as a religious movement that my ideas and interpretations need not be yours. In ethical culture, the platform, I believe, is a process, an implicit dialogue in the sense that the speaker presents his or her views, and those who are present can take from those views what they find compelling and push aside what they don't, and perhaps use what is put forward to reflect and refine their own viewpoints and their own opinions. I do the speaking and you the listening, but my hope is that your listening is not passive listening, but constitutive of an internal dynamic process which inspires for you reflection and thought. I want to talk about humanism. That's the mainstay of my address. Contemporary humanism emerges from several streams that have flowed into each other. Its development has been complex, so I will begin with the briefest historical survey before I move on to discuss where I have emerged. As I see it, modern humanism has three major sources that converged in the 20th century. The first was the extraordinary revolution brought by the European Enlightenment of the 18th century. The Enlightenment ushered in the end of the Middle Ages and created the modern world. The Enlightenment created science, and as such began to replace supernatural explanations of the world with secular ones. It attacked religion for not only being superstitious, but in the hands of power-hungry churchmen, a major source of human oppression and misery. The Enlightenment replaced the autocracy and feudalism of the Middle Ages, wherein the power of the state issued from kings and the power of God from above, by democracy in which the power of the state came from the people below. It discovered and encoded into the law the idea of individual rights and proclaimed that it is the duty of the state to protect those individual rights and to foster an environment of freedom. The Enlightenment was a heady and exhilarating time. Its temperament was one of skepticism, secularism, and cosmopolitanism. It extended from Edinburgh to Naples, Paris to Berlin, Boston to Philadelphia. It sought to replace ignorance with knowledge, superstition and illusion with reason, authoritarianism with democracy, degradation with dignity, the childhood of humankind with its maturity, traditional religion with secularism, divine will with natural law. But most of all, the Enlightenment cherished freedom, the freedom to inquire, the freedom to know, and the freedom from political tyranny. The Enlightenment claimed such geniuses as the Scotsman David Hume and Adam Smith, the Englishman John Locke and Jeremy Bentham, the Germans Gotthold Lessing and Immanuel Kant, the Italian Cesare Beccaria, the Frenchman Montesquieu, Rousseau, and Voltaire, and the Americans Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, among dozens of others. These philosophes, as they were called, preached ethics and free trade, tolerance and universalism, democracy and revolution, human dignity, and humane punishment for criminals. While most of these figures did not abandon their belief in God, they relegated God to the austere and impersonal role of the grand architect of the universe, while they moved to the forefront their concerns, the radical and progressive improvement of human society, and employed reason, science, and political freedom as the vehicles to get us there. The most exalted of human faculties, the Enlightenment proclaimed, was reason. Reason. Always proclaimed, always written with a capital R. Not scripture, not blind faith, but reason should be the governor of our lives. When we talk about the emergence of humanism, perhaps the contribution of the greatest of the Enlightenment philosophers, the German Immanuel Kant, was the most influential. I should say the greatest and the most inscrutable, okay, if anybody's tried to read Immanuel Kant in any language. I mean, it's said that German students in Germany, when they read Kant, buy the American, the English translations, because at least the sentences aren't 3 pages long in English, right? Very, very difficult thinker, but very, very influential. Well, Kant did 2 things that are relevant to the emergence of humanism. First, he provided the most powerful philosophical defense of human dignity. He proclaimed that when it comes to human beings, morality demands that we not treat the humanity we find in others and in ourselves merely as a means or as a tool to be exploited for our own interests, but we regard human beings, as he put it, as ends in themselves. That is, as reasoning and autonomous free agents to be respected and reverenced as such. A century later, Kant was to find a disciple in our own Felix Adler, the founder of the ethical culture movement, who remained essentially a Kantian all his life. The second contribution to the emergence of humanism had to do with Kant's theory of knowledge. Okay, this is a little more complex. Kant argued that that which we can truly know can be based only on the experience, the only knowledge we can have has to come through our experience. That is, as we engage in the world, we use our 5 senses, and we take our sense experience and we mix it up with ideas, and we, in effect, come to knowledge. But the only knowledge we can have has to be knowledge that comes through our experiences, okay? That which is beyond our experience, that which transcends our experience, Kant proclaimed we simply cannot know. And the greatest transcendental reality, the greatest transcendent being, is of course God. Consequently, according to Kant's theory of knowledge, we cannot claim any knowledge about God, even whether he or she exists. We may have faith that he does, but we cannot know with any certainty or confidence or conviction that he does. What Kant did, therefore, was to open the door philosophically to agnosticism, which is a line of thought that emerged and became very popular among intellectuals, especially in Victorian England and America in the late 19th century. A second stream, so much for Kant, a second stream which fed into the formation of humanism also derives from Kant's theory of knowledge and flourished in the United States before the Civil War. The most significant figure in this regard was the New England sage and essayist Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson started his career as a Unitarian minister. It should be said that the Unitarianism of his day is not at all what Unitarianism is today. It was then highly doctrinal, Bible-based, certainly God-centered, rigid, priggish, and the possession of high-minded Boston Brahmins who occupied the ruling class of the day. It was, as Emerson came to call it, quote, corpse cold. Okay, so much for Unitarian. Not warm and fuzzy, okay? Sort of, not, but what he referred to as corpse cold, that's why he left. Under the pressures of modern science and influenced by the idealism of Immanuel Kant, Emerson left the Unitarian ministry, abandoned his belief in Christianity, and declared along the way that, quote, miracles are monsters. Emerson was a romantic. Among the beliefs of Romanticism, is important, is that intuition or feeling is, as opposed to reason, feeling is like a sixth sense. Sixth sense. The feelings we have, in other words, are an organ of knowledge. And so Emerson radically revived Kant's thinking by saying we could actually get to know transcendental realities, not through experience, not through science, but again through feelings and intuitions which conveyed a type of immediacy, he believed, and certainty. He affirmed that the heart has its reasons that reason knows not, so to speak. If I know that Mary loves me, I know that this is true, not because I've done a scientific study or an experiment on Mary that has brought me to that conclusion. I just simply know it. Okay, I know it in my heart. I feel it, I know it. And that type of knowledge has a type of certainty. I know Mary loves me beyond a doubt. Okay, and it's not because of experience, it's something I feel, it's in my feeling in my heart. Okay, that's a sort of romantic notion. And sort of Emerson's take on Kant and his radical revision of Kant's theory of knowledge and so on. Anyway, what Emerson created was a belief system that became known as transcendentalism, because you could know transcendental realities through intuition. Emerson did not believe in a personal God, but he did believe in the supervening reality of transcendent ideals such as truth, goodness, justice, and beauty. For Emerson, the ideals are austerely impersonal, but highly spiritualized, and they flow through all reality, all of nature, including us. For Emerson, these ideals are equated with the divine, which means that we human beings are also partly divine ourselves, which is a profound Christian heresy. As noted, for Emerson and his fellow transcendentalists, such as Henry David Thoreau, who's sort of the father of modern environmentalism, he was a colleague. For all of these transcendentalists, nature is highly spiritual, which is one of the reasons why they used to spend a lot of time walking around in the woods, either in the Berkshires or they had homes in the Adirondacks, and they're always walking around in the woods, all right? Emerson talks about communing with trees and even having a rapport and relationship with vegetables, which are, other than eating them, he would talk to, he says in his essay, I'm not making this up, it's over the top, but in his, if you read his beautiful essay on nature, he says, I walk through the woods and I speak to the vegetable and the vegetable speaks to me. Okay, there's a type of spiritual rapport that he has with nature, with trees and all of nature and so on, including vegetables. All of them are manifestations of a spiritual divine reality that flows through them and through us. It should be said that next to Kant, Emerson was the second greatest influence on Felix Adler, and Adler had actually met Emerson when Adler was in his 20s and Emerson in his 70s. But it should also be said that neither Emerson nor Adler were humanists in the way in which we use the term today. In fact, Felix Adler didn't like the term humanism because he felt that it asserted a misplaced emphasis on human beings and their welfare first and foremost, and it was too, in other words, humanocentric. Our primary focus in life, rather, should be on transcendental ideals, which he believed, as did Emerson, are more real than the physical and natural world we know through our experiences. That's called idealism, and it goes all the way back to Plato. And I sometimes talk philosophically with my students about this. It seems so counterintuitive to say that an idea, let's say like a triangle, is more real than this lectern. But Plato believed it, and so did Kant, and so did Felix Adler, and so did Emerson. And their argument was, if you compare the idea of the triangle with the lectern, the triangle is more real because the triangle doesn't change, and it is eternal. The triangle is here now, it'll be here in the future. It was here in the age of the dinosaurs, maybe even came into existence at or before the Big Bang. In other words, there's something deathless, changeless, and absolute about ideas, okay, mathematical ideals, and ideals, and so on and so forth. With this lectern, by contrast, it's small potatoes. It came into existence at some point, and it'll pass away, okay, to be long forgotten. So in that sense, idealists would argue that ideas are in some sense more real than indeed physical objects such as you and I or anything else we can know through our experience, right? That's the idealist assumption. That's an interesting, I don't believe it myself, but there are interesting arguments philosophically, okay? So after the Civil War, and again, under the pressure of science and agnosticism, to which Darwinism gave a major boost, certain Unitarian ministers, especially in the Midwest, began to use the term humanism to describe a belief system which replaced the reality of these impersonal ideals with a focus on human beings as thoroughly natural beings and the need to support human interests and the flourishing of human beings. Humanism entered left-wing religious vocabulary. Well, a third major stream in the creation of contemporary humanism was arguably the thought of John Dewey, the greatest luminary of the Columbia Philosophy Department, and his followers. When I sat for my orals for my dissertation at Columbia, there was an oil portrait of John Dewey looking over my shoulder. Okay, that was my inspiration. Not Felix Adler, okay, but John Dewey looking over my shoulder. Okay, I passed my orals. Right. Okay. Dewey stood opposed to philosophical idealism. Used to debate that at Columbia with Felix Adler. Dewey stood opposed to philosophical idealism, which had been the leading philosophy of the 19th century, especially in continental Europe. In America in the 20th century, idealism was replaced by a philosophy of naturalism, which in simplest terms is the belief that nature is all there is and there's nothing outside of nature. I'm personally a naturalist philosophically. We, of course, recognize ideals, but unlike the beliefs of Kant, Emerson, and Adler, naturalists affirm that ideals grow out of the natural processes of our physical brains when they interact with our experiences, and ideals have no independent or prior existence of their own. As such, human beings are totally natural beings, and by extension, the highest purpose in life is to ensure human flourishing. With that assertion, contemporary humanism came into its own. Okay, so I've mentioned three strands that feed into the creation of what we understand to be the underlying philosophy today of ethical culture. Among certain intellectuals, humanism began to take shape around a cluster of beliefs and principles. And what emerged were a series of humanist manifestos laying out these principles. The first, Humanist Manifesto 1, published in 1933, contained 15 briefly stated principles. Emerging from it was an organization, the American Humanist Association, founded in 1941, mostly again by left-wing Unitarians. The AHA was founded as a totally secular organization and remains so today. In the 1960s, in a written statement, leaders in the ethical culture movement, our movement, explicitly identify ethical culture as a humanist movement, and as we know, some ethical culture societies change their names to ethical humanist societies in order to confirm this identification. In recent decades, we have seen a profusion of new rationalist, secularist, and atheist organizations which are part of a growing humanist movement, we might say. Whereas the first humanist manifesto was drafted in the name of what they called religious humanism, a second manifesto, written in 1973, is a wholly secular document and takes a stronger position in opposition to religion and reflects more closely what these new humanist organizations stand for. Well, where am I going with this? Where I'm leading is that whereas humanism defines itself as opposing creeds and dogmas, which it associates with traditional religion and strongly affirms intellectual freedom, it has nevertheless coalesced around a series of identifiable beliefs and principles which define it. Among these beliefs is the guiding importance of reason, an abiding belief in science and the scientific method, a commitment to the rules of evidence, an appreciation for individual and political freedom, a commitment to democracy as the best form of governance, a pressing need to establish a just world built on fairness and equality for all, a dedication to individualism and individual rights, commitment to knowledge and education, and a respect for the dignity of all human beings. I think it would be also accurate to say that a major dynamic that drives contemporary humanism is seeing itself in opposition to traditional supernatural religion, which is a product of its Enlightenment heritage, and with a little dose of Marxism thrown in. You know, and Karl Marx said religion is the opiate of the people, and we had a lot of socialists who were actually, were tinged with Marxism when they came over from Eastern Europe, in the early 20th century. So contemporary humanism is really a philosophical naturalism with a little dose of Marxism as well. Whereas religion is benighted, superstitious, irrational, unprovable, and divides people from each other, is oppressive, and provides justification for violence and a whole raft of other evils, humanism, by contrast, in addition to being secular, is rational, liberating, respectful of the autonomy of the person, places a premium on human welfare, fulfillment, and happiness, and is essentially progressive. For humanism, religion is the foil, the boogeyman, against which it primarily defines itself. I hope I'm being clear here. My point again is that humanism, as it is evolved into a movement, has centered itself around this particular cluster of principles and beliefs. The fact that humanism so defines itself around a series of beliefs is inevitable and unavoidable. After all, we all define ourselves and communicate ourselves to others to who we are by articulating what it is we believe, what our opinions are, the principles we hold, and so forth. In great measure, we identify ourselves with what we believe, and even more so, do movements of whatever kind. You gravitate towards beliefs to try to understand what a movement stands for. But it is at this point, and this is where I'm bringing this to a close in a little while, it's at this point that I become personal and admit that my appreciation and understanding of humanism has begun to change. I need to be very clear, however. Throughout my career as a professional humanist, I have affirmed these beliefs and principles that I've just mentioned, have centered and built my life around them, and I continue to do so. Okay, I've not abandoned the general core of beliefs in humanism. However essential, I've moved a little bit, however essential such beliefs are, I've come nevertheless to the viewpoint that identifying humanism around beliefs alone does not embrace the deeper meaning of what humanism is or what it means to be a humanist. Beliefs, in my view, do not necessarily a humanist make. In other words, humanism is not solely a system of belief or principles that a person holds. I have come to see rather humanism as what we might call a disposition, an orientation, a sensibility, an expression of character which reaches far more deeply than merely a roster of beliefs and principles. Humanism is sometimes criticized as being overly intellectual at the expense of feelings. And to a certain extent, I think this is true. As human beings, we are far more than the beliefs we hold. We are creatures of feelings, emotions, drives, proclivities, and our complex inner lives. We are creatures of contradictions and irrational yearnings and wishes. We experience joy and tragedy and much more that makes us human. It was the ancient Roman playwright Terence who once said, quote, "I am a human being, therefore nothing human is alien from me," end quote. It is that sensibility that I'm aiming for, I want a humanism that is broad and deep enough to appreciate the farther reaches of the human experience. That humanism that I'm aiming for is manifest in people who possess what I might call a feeling for humanity, for the human dimension that expresses itself in art and in music, in human expressions of joy and tragedy, in all their subtlety and nuance, and most of all, in the human character. People who are artistically trained can see this human dimension in certain great works of art, or hear the human cry in certain strains of music, and certainly in novels, poetry, and drama. We may not be able to clearly define this element, but with a touch of the romantic, perhaps, we perceive an indwelling dignity in the struggles of women and men, in our fellow human beings, who are fated to assert their finite and limited capacities against a reality which is always far greater than we are. And we can see this element in other human beings who have an abiding empathy for the pain of others, who are moved by compassion and are people of deep-rooted moral substance. The most beautiful word in Yiddish, which I have some conversance in, is the most beautiful word and ideal is to be a mensch. To be a mensch. To call someone a mensch is to mean that they are a person of really great moral substance. That they are people, you can feel it in their character. So-and-so, Barbara is a mensch. Okay, Jeffrey is a mensch. It's to have a type of moral substance. That's sort of what I'm talking about here. This feeling, this sensitivity, is not something that can be reduced to a principle or neatly communicated in belief. It exists and expresses itself at a deeper level of human experience. It is a sensitivity to the unique dimensions of the human condition. Humanism, as earlier described, is most comfortable in what I've sometimes referred to as the harder values, the values of justice, equality, fairness. These hard values are objective values that in some sense can be measured. The humanism I'm speaking of now appreciates what we might call the softer values, values such as compassion, kindness, empathy, values that are harder to objectify, but I argue of no lesser importance. Some tough-minded humanists may sneeringly dismiss the importance of being nice to others, seeing niceness as mere sentimentalism. Being right and being principled, they might argue, is far more important. But I would contend being a nice person and being kind and sensitive to the feelings of others is of the greatest value. We would have a far better world if people were simply nicer and kinder to one another. Considering humanism in this wider sense, religion for me, I must admit, is not the foil, is not the boogeyman. No doubt much religion is stupid, embarrassingly anti-intellectual, patriarchal, oppressive, and cruel. But I have no doubt that if religion were to disappear tomorrow, it would not take more than an instant for certain people to cling to other ideologies, be nationalism, tribalism, or whatever, as rationales to oppress or kill their fellow human beings. Okay, religion is not the major or sole source of evil in the world. On the other hand, I must admit, I have some very good and intimate friends who are conservatively religious, but who nevertheless are exceedingly compassionate and sensitive human beings, sensitive to the humanity of others, not merely to their own, but to people more broadly. And being such, I conclude that there is a great deal of humanism in these friends of mine and people like them. To my mind, in other words, character counts far more than formal belief. What matters to me more is how people are, not solely what they believe. And so I will end this address as I began. We are in very difficult times. We are going to need to stiffen our spines and use whatever resources we have to do battle with the political and social challenges that threaten us. I believe that there is real evil in the world, and we cannot pretend otherwise. We need to confront those forces that threaten our democracy and our freedom. But as we do so, let us not permit the enemy to define us. Let us plan, organize, and struggle as we must. But at the same time, let us not lose sight of what at the farthest reaches matters most. As we are just, let us also be kind. As we are tough, let us also be compassionate. As we are principled, let us also be forgiving. As we are strong, let us also be sensitive. And as we are righteous in our cause, let us also be humble.